Hello, everybody. Scott Simi here in Toronto from DroneDJ. It's time for another weekly panel. And today we are very pleased to have a special guest who's actually been in the news in the last 24 hours or so. And that's David Benowitz in Shenzhen. Dave is the head of research with DroneAnalyst, which we regard as kind of the most credible industry overview and annual report. Welcome, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for having me on. Kind of always good to be kind of part of the DroneDJ team.
Awesome. We're really appreciate that you could do this, especially at short notice. And joining us from France is Bruce Crumley. Thanks, Bruce. Good to see you again. We're going to jump right into the annual report that was just been released by DroneAnalyst. There's always a lot of insight in there. And I'm wondering, Dave, if you could just start by just giving us kind of a high-level picture of your findings.
Yeah. So our report is kind of our big annual report that we release every year. And so we kind of detox just kind of the 4 key insights and just released those yesterday. So kind of the 4 biggest takeaways for everyone to know is really number 1, that business and agency users are spending a lot more on their drone programs. We've kind of historically seen many programs spend below 10K. So 10K USD per year on additional services, additional hardware. And now we're kind of hitting where the average drone program is spending above that. And this spending is especially accelerated among the utility segment. The second is that we're finally seeing a lot more competition in the drone hardware sector. So obviously everyone here knows, DJI has been the long reigning king of the drone industry. And very much the history of our reports is also the history of that increasing dominance. And this year, things have really changed. We've seen them kind of be at 69, 70 something percent. And this year they took a 15-point dip in the commercial market, just down to 54%. The third key takeaway is that we are also seeing service providers' revenues also reaching more sustainable levels. So this is kind of a mix of everything, but as businesses are spending more money on drones and services, that's also being seen on the service providers as well. And this is a key metric that we really see as a health indicator for the industry, just because this number has really stagnated ever since 2017, 2016. And now that we're really seeing it start to grow, it's a really good sign for the industry. And kind of the last piece there is that we are starting to finally see some more market consolidation and maturity in the software space. We've really always seen this being kind of the Wild West. Everyone has multiple different drone softwares. They have a variety of different free and freemium and then paid ones as well. And we're starting to see 2 kind of kings raised among them, primarily led by Drone Deploy and then Pix4D. But then we're also seeing a bit more maturity across the board there. So that's kind of a very high level look at what are the key insights and takeaways from the report.
I'm interested if you could give us some more details with respect to DJI in terms of the commercial or sort of the hobbyist market versus the enterprise market. I understand there's still kind of a massive dominance for the hobbyist and recreational user.
Yeah, correct. And so, this report is primarily focusing on really just the commercial and enterprise segments of the market. So when we say 54% market share, that's 54% share of new hardware purchases among commercial customers, so enterprise customers as well, and some government as well. But when we're talking more about the consumer side of things, our previous research and analyzing customs data really shows that their consumer market dominance hasn't been threatened. Despite the entity list addition, despite a lot of the hoopla in the news, we are still seeing them really be dominant, and we estimate their market share to be above 94%. And when you get above 94%, it gets hard to calculate if it goes higher than that. So, we're really topping towards a really dominant market player here.
I'm not sure if your data shows you this part, but when you see that dip on the commercial enterprise side, do you have a sense, whether the entity list, whether sort of the ongoing US-China issues and country of origin, whether that's playing a role, or if it's more that there are other competitors out there that are offering products that these enterprise clients want?
Yeah, so we have a few different ways that we track this, and the answer to this question is not so simple. But it's kind of a mix of a lot of different things. One, overall, we're seeing the trend that people are moving to more sophisticated and diverse hardware. And just naturally, a single vendor won't be able to satisfy their needs. If you're looking for a fixed wing drone, you still can't find a DJI fixed wing in the market. So that's one reason. The other reason is certainly because of a lot of concerns around country of origin, around the entity list, or the blue list as well. And so people are really just buying more hardware to start testing things out, because maybe you need to move vendors in the future. So it's a little bit of that as well. And then there's also a bit more on the security side, but I'd really start to say it's more of diversity from other hardware and other vendors as well. Just even speaking about a lot of these new US players, last year, a lot of them weren't able to deliver hardware. This year, they're starting to. And so we're starting to see this have a lot of impact on what hardware people are testing, what hardware people are starting to buy as well.
Bruce, I'd like you to hop in if you could. I know you've had a look at the basics of the report. Have some questions for Dave?
Yeah, you just kind of answered the question that I was going to ask partially, but I'll come at it from a different angle. I guess if programs are on the rise among business and government agency users, the latter, in some cases, not being able to buy DJI drones, wouldn't that kind of naturally feed an increase in, or I should say, wouldn't that an increase in competitors' market share, i.e. American companies, basically? And the other thing, I guess, is, can you flesh out let's just boil it, the idea I've just put down is horrible situation of atmosphere for Chinese companies in general, and DJI in the US. Naturally, that's going to help out American rivals. To what degree would that translate into the drop we saw, i.e. isn't the hobbyist drone market so huge anyway that shouldn't be more than just kind of a blip?
Yeah, and the hobbyist and consumer space is still larger than the enterprise space from just hardware sold and how much money is being spent. So if you're a DJI investor these days, you're probably not crying over these numbers. I don't think Frank is shaking in his boots quite yet. For the larger question around kind of the environment for Chinese companies, I will say that the largest company and kind of growing to replace, or I guess capture some of DJI's market share, is another Chinese company, is Autel Robotics. And so, yeah, they didn't suck up all of the lost market share that DJI left on the table, but they grew to become the second place company. Part of that is because, they have a better supply chain. Their hardware tends to be more similar to DJI's than anyone else on the market. So they're a very natural fit to kind of swap over to them and start testing them out. Also, other reasons like their unlock, their geofencing system, all this other stuff is kind of a logical reason for people to move to them first. But we really, I don't think it's necessarily that itself. It's also that there's a few of these companies that have quite interesting value propositions. Look at a Skydio with their autonomy. Look at a Brink with their tactical features that's just super focused and super interesting. FreeFly with their platform approach. Ascent Aerosystems with their very unique design. You're starting to see more of this very unique hardware done in the US that's more diverse than any other ecosystem. So kind of before you would say maybe it's because of the US policies, but now it's also becoming that, while the US doesn't have the largest drone ecosystem overall, it certainly has the most diverse from a hardware perspective.
I'm curious, Dave, whether your data shows or whether you've got some understanding of the relative importance to DJI of the enterprise market versus the consumer market.
Yes, I do. I can't name off the top of my head, but it's something like it's not such a significant portion. I'm pulling up in a second.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, their main market has really just been the consumer, and so while the enterprise and then agriculture for them, I kind of separate that out since it's not imaging, it's mostly spraying drones and not something we see too much in the US. Just kind of looking at these numbers, glancing at the chart, we're looking at 2017, 2018, we're talking maybe 80-90% consumer, and now it's maybe looking more 70%. So we're talking about their market share dropping in a growing market. This isn't necessarily going to hit the bottom line. So that's kind of, where we talk about people probably aren't too worried about kind of the profit margins and the revenues there.
I know you've had one other report recently that I thought was incredibly well researched, and it was so dense with information that I had to go back and read it a couple of times, and that's around open source, Auterion and people using an open source platform. What's your sense about open source and the appeal that might offer to enterprise clients?
Yeah. So I'll kind of speak first about the value to the enterprise ecosystem of kind of vendors is just having this kind of jump starting point. Building a flight controller, is a PETA. It's very complicated. It's not something anyone wants to do and spend their time working on. Being able to plug and play into a PX4 and RG Pilot ecosystem is really a godsend for these manufacturers, and they have an ecosystem of kind of flight control manufacturers as well. From the enterprise side, and kind of, I think the best case is to look at the DoD because they're starting to require this through the Defense Innovation Unit, requiring this type of open source connection. The dream eventually is that me as an enterprise customer, I can really just tap into one ecosystem of products, and no matter who the actual hardware vendor is, I have a singular control scheme, maybe even the same remote controller, and then also that the data is synced into the same online platform as well. So in this way, it's a lot more scalable for us to really deploy robotics, and kind of hopefully eventually this becomes not just a standard for flying robots, but also for those on the ground. So you could imagine an army deployment or something like that. Imagine them swapping between different vendors' firmware on site. That doesn't make any sense. So kind of the dream is that you have one remote controller that can pair with any kind of variation of hardware and being able to have this hot swapping ability. That's the same thing for enterprises or utilities firms, not having to worry so much about the vendor and more focusing on the capabilities of the hardware itself, and the core control education you need for your users.
We've got a comment in asking us to speak about the Mavic 3, and we're certainly going to get to that. But before we do, I wanted to jump into one of the other really big things that's happened in this past week, and that was the departure on Friday from DJI of Brendan Schulman, who gave DroneDJ kind of an exclusive, very long, lengthy interview reflecting on his career. Brendan was the vice president of policy, I hope I've got that title right, at DJI, and was really a key lobbyist and advocate who really truly influenced many of the regulations that we currently have in the North America, in the drone world, but in the US in particular, although his influence has certainly been felt in other countries. David, were you surprised to hear the news? And you've worked with Brendan. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of an insight into his impact on the industry.
Yeah, I've really had the privilege, and it really was a privilege to work alongside Brendan for many years. When I did work at DJI, and my overall opinion is that the industry is really going to feel his departure. Brendan really joined with the love for drones as a hobby, and really making sure that people could fly and have access to the airspace for fun. And it kind of really expanded from that core point. And so, his loss to the industry, he's really one of the largest voices, in my opinion, especially behind the scenes, in speaking up for hobbyists and regulations that go for them. He's not the only one, but from my opinion, at least, he's a key one. I think the larger question, though, is whether or not DJI is going to invest to, replace his role or not, because DJI, as kind of the sole hobbyist, manufacturer of hardware, needs to be investing in this type of lobbying to really support positive regulations in the US, but also more globally.
Now, I know you probably watch the goings on at DJI closely because you worked there for a number of years, and it's part of your job to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of the industry. But when we saw Brendan's departure, such a high-profile guy, last December, we saw Romeo Dersher leave, who was very much involved with public safety. And there have been many other departures this year. What's your sense of what's going on when you look at the trend?
Yeah, I mean, these are a lot of departures of very public-facing people, but it really extends much deeper into their R&D and even manufacturing, sourcing teams as well. And so there's that whole Chinese side that we're not seeing reported in the news, but is still kind of people leaving the company. I'll say it's a big cultural shift, and I've seen it from working with the company or talking to them as well. So we'll see how they kind of fare. And I think a lot of international businesses have had similar type of situations during COVID, and we'll see exactly how they fare. But I think certainly they've had this kind of cultural shift. They've had a shift in resources that they have also on the field in just in the US market. How many people are really left representing DJI, selling their products, engaging with customers as well. So I think this will be the biggest challenge for them forward. How do they rebuild from here? How do they become, this international brand that they really were originally?
Now, obviously, whenever a new DJI product comes out, they don't really have to do a lot of advertising because there are so many people who purchase those products regularly that they know and they just go ahead and buy. It feels like when you look at the numbers of people who have departed on the US side, almost as if there's kind of been a withdrawal from the US. Now, do you have any sense of what is behind it? Now, you say cultural shift, but is the entity list or some of the geopolitics? I have no idea what is behind it. So if you have any insight that you can share, please feel free.
Yeah, it's more of the long-term people who were very senior in the company have started to leave, and People tend to leave when the senior management leaves as well. So that's kind of the crux of it. Obviously Brendan's a very public face, but similarly, there's large leaders in the R&D teams and their internal marketing teams, sales teams, et cetera, that have similarly departed in kind of the recent year or two. And that's kind of how a lot of this goes, right? Shenzhen is like the Silicon Valley of China. So just like in Silicon Valley, where people can very easily hop companies, it's the same thing here. And a lot of other companies have seen what DJI has done, and they're very much willing to hire DJI team members or ex-DJI employees. So I'll say that's kind of like the core thing driving it. I wouldn't say they're going to be retrenching from the market, but more assessing, what do they really need to do. And, we've seen a lot of publications about reform, and that's been a big thing at the company too, as well, from people that I've talked to, of just really figuring out what the company needs to be publicly as well, especially when they're trying to invest in making car components too. So we'll see. Maybe after COVID, after this big reform and cultural shift, DJI is a very different company than what we've kind of known them for.
But do you think this exodus would have any brass tacks bottom line impact anyway? Because when you mentioned Silicon Valley, look what happens. There are companies get bombarded with lousy news. And people leave Facebook in droves, and yet users, even if they hate the thing, they stick with it. In DJI's case, if you have 90% of hobbyists using it, they're probably going to think, oh, okay, headlines, bunch of suits leaving the company. What's the new product coming out? Could it hurt it at all business wise, or do drone users generally just don't care about how the company is run?
Yeah. I think for sure the customer shouldn't necessarily care about this as long as the products are great, and they have a really big tech lead. I think we'll see in the future, how that changes. But I would say more specifically, like, in our previous report from earlier this year, like we reported on their annual revenues from the data that we've gotten. And, it's not significantly growing. So I guess the core question is that if they're just sitting in their position in the market, is the market growing? Are they growing as well? Because if on the consumer side of the market too, if they're going to sell the same products to the same customers every 2 years, revenue is not necessarily trending upwards. They can keep on pushing their costs lower, do more automation on that side, and keep a heavy profit every year. But I think that's the core question, right? What is the ambition for the company as well? And at this time, I think that's really the big question. We haven't seen a big marketing campaign for drones. The same people who buy drones are kind of, to Scott's point, very similar group every year. I did see a lot of more interest during COVID of people just buying any type of product to go adventure and outside and take trips. But we aren't seeing anyone spending money on Super Bowl ads. So you can kind of think what other products maybe you see being regularly advertised on these kind of mainstream channels. And, we're only seeing KOLs on YouTube that already use drones using the product. So I think the larger question is the consumer market growing? Maybe not. And if we look at the enterprise market as well, where they're losing, it's kind of a big question mark. So I think to your point, like we won't see their revenue. They're not going to tank. I don't think they're going to fail in any way. But I think it's just more of what is the growth prospect for a company where, we haven't seen a vision being portrayed by them or communicated by them for quite a while.
Dave, I inquired just a little over a year ago through official channels asking DJI, like, how big are you these days? How many employees do you have? And the figure I was given at that point, I think it was last July, like a year ago, July, was 14,000. And that roughly 40% or more were engineers. Any sense on, if the company is continuing to grow, if that ratio of engineers to total employees is actually an accurate one?
Yeah, I'll just say they stopped updating that figure by the time before I left. So I don't think that number has changed. Always said that number should have changed. So I don't know. I think that's a good question for their PR team, for their corporate team as well. But I'll know that I haven't seen that number change publicly at all.
Gotcha. We're going to move on to another topic. One of the interesting stories this week, we love to report about drones for good. This is a case of drones for bad. And it's a story that Bruce wrote earlier in the week. Bruce, give us some details of what happened and what the implications might be.
Yeah, on Monday, the administration that runs Ecuador's penitentiary system tweeted this thing that basically said, we've been attacked by 3 drones. It's one of the biggest penitentiaries in Guayaquil was attacked by 3 explosive dropping drones, and it wasn't quite sure from the report whether they hit this this kind of secondary annex on purpose and missed the main jail or not. But the bottom line was it blew apparently a bunch of holes in the roof and ceiling of holding cells. And incredibly, some of the reports said that inmates climbed out onto the roof and started shooting at the drones to try to take them out as enemy, combatant vehicles or something. And I'm thinking, wow, you hit a little security problem there, I guess. Arm the inmates. Yeah, okay. Got anything stronger than that bazooka there? Come on, arm up. And anyway, that was just kind of a side note. But the point is that the authorities said that this is very clearly was a hit ordered by international drug cartels targeting gang leaders affiliated with rival cartels. And it's just kind of amazing to see that drones could get that close to one of the country's biggest penitentiaries, holding some of the biggest baddies there are. And second, that we're just seeing more and more and more people using drones for bad. I mean, we saw it in the Middle East with ISIS and other groups. I just did stories today on a New Jersey ex-con being sentenced to 3.5 years for having, just weeks after being released from prison, running drone contraband into prison. And in Canada, in Quebec, a prison which has been targeted by illegal drone deliveries of contraband, discovered brass knuckles and fighting knives among the illicit matter that was smuggled into prison. So drones for bad it's proliferating, and you're kind of wondering, given the way that criminals tend to be always one step ahead, whether they're hackers or burglars of authorities, that whether this is going to get even more widespread and worse, more deadly.
Now, given that, someone, regardless, without a background check, obviously, can just go ahead and purchase a drone online from any manufacturer, pretty much, unless it's like an agricultural spraying drone. I'm wondering, David, if you see, a solution to this is greater deployment of drone countermeasures something that we're likely to see in the future, or are there other ways that might mitigate this issue?
Yeah, I think in kind of the first point is that, drone manufacturers of enterprise hardware shouldn't necessarily be selling their products online. A consumer drone that someone can really jerry-rig, but it's a very complicated job to do this type of thing. I think that's fine to sell online, but these type of larger, more expensive aircraft should generally be sold through the channel with kind of somebody vetting in some way. We're not going to require legal documents or something like that, but I think that's a key point of it. Certainly we've seen a lot more of this kind of CUIS industry rising, and a few of these solutions quite interesting as well. I'm also excited to see how the FAA's new remote identification rules will have an impact, but I still think we're pretty far away. I mean, the idea of this, at least, is it provides some accountability. If you're flying a consumer drone, it's automatically transmitting some sort of identification hardware or identification signal. So it'll be really interesting to see how that really plays into it. But I still don't think the proliferation of drones for bad, and also just in general, is enough where we're seeing too many people take very specific countermeasures, except outside of very specific, high profile events like the Olympics.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we had a question I mentioned earlier about the Mavic 3, and we've been touching on DJI, so we'll hop into that. And there are a couple of interesting things here. There are more leaks that have started to come out. We've seen, a sketch that appears to actually be a photoshopped image that is made now to look like a sketch that shows the drone with a camera module that has 2 Hasselblad cameras on it. One is a digital zoom, the other is a wide angle lens. Depending on where you're getting your information from, it's either 5.7K resolution, possibly 8K resolution, maybe a 1-inch sensor. So these sorts of details are starting to come out. And we heard the other day from a source of ours in China that actually a source in the US, but who is very closely connected with China, that manufacturing of the product is now underway. So we're guessing for an October release. Just before I get to you with the question, Dave, one interesting thing is that a source in China who we have regularly spoken with and has always been really very reliable, talked to me yesterday and said, hey, I just had a full briefing on the new Mavic 3. And I'm like, great, what did you hear? And he said, I can't tell you anything. I have signed a document, some sort of NDA that prevents him from sharing that information. Do you have a sense, Dave, in the past with commercial products in particular, we always see a lot of leaked stuff in the lead up to the product release. Sometimes it's even felt as though DJI might have had a hand in some of those leaks. Is your sense that things are tightening up internally in terms of employees and ensuring that information does not reach the market prior to a product's release?
Yeah, I'll say, to connect our earlier conversation, I'll say having a retention problem also means you have fewer people who know that many people outside of the organization. So it also inherently makes it a little bit easier to kind of close the traps and really rein in the information. But yeah, everyone I've kind of talked to has been a lot more strict on, just who has the information, both inside the company and outside the company, and are kind of correcting it and constraining it in a much more kind of stringent manner.
Can you tell me, just in terms of your sense of the commercial market? I mean, certainly we're feeling that there's a lot of anticipation about this product's release. How important is one of these sort of high-end prosumer drones to DJI overall?
Yeah, I mean, we've historically seen, and we've done some calculations to even measure this and estimate this as well, is that historically a lot of enterprises have been turning towards primarily consumer aircraft, and that's primarily more looking like the Phantom 4 Pro is the classic version of this, which that drone was pretty much the perfect mapping drone until the Phantom 4 RTK and kind of more competitive products from other vendors also came to the market. So I think whenever we're talking about a small drone with a 1-inch sensor, probably higher resolution than 20 megapixels, it'll be attractive to quite a few people in the commercial market outside of just the cinematography and photography space. So I think it always depends, and just how exactly the shutter is put up. Is it going to be a mechanical shutter, electronic shutter, this type of thing? But you'll certainly see a lot of commercial users purchasing this product in the future.
Interestingly, one other final comment that this source of ours was able to give me is he said, I don't think anyone will be buying the Inspire 2 anymore once this product is released. Do you think that might be a reasonable thing to suggest? I mean, the Inspire 2 is also, getting a little long in the tooth. It's still a fantastic drone, but it's been around for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think DJI's kind of made it clear they don't want to update that product, and well, I think that may be true. I don't think that's really what professionals want. The Inspire 2 has a lot of other benefits that something like a Mavic size just can never deliver when it comes down to the raising gear, when it comes down to the durability, the reliability of it, having the dual kind of RC connection, the master and slave connection, which I believe the Mavics can't do, but you can correct me on that. I might be wrong. So yeah, I think it's sad for cinematographers and photographers that may be true, but I wouldn't be too surprised if that's the direction.
And so the latest we're hearing is probably an October release. We had conflicting information on this for a while. We're told at one point that due to some delays in finalizing the design, that it might be pushed to January, but it now seems that the signals are for October. The fact that the Mavic 2 Pro is no longer available online, except in very rare circumstances and bundled with the smart controller, would suggest that they are getting ready to launch the product. So we will watch eagerly for that release. Dave Benowitz, I really appreciate you hopping in, especially at short notice, and we really value your insight. I think it's really added a lot to the panel today. So thank you so much for joining us. Bruce, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here as well. So we're going to wrap it up with that. We're getting very close to 30 minutes, which is when we like to kind of knock things off. So for everyone, I'm Scott Simi. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again, guys. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks.